On today's episode of Locked On Wild, David Jiricek to Iowa. It's time to trust the process.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, we are your team each and every day. We thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we get a little intel on what David Jiricek brings to the table from Sebastian High of Locked On NHL Prospects. We'll also take a look at what John Hynes had to say about Jiricek being sent down to Iowa and reasons that he has, as of yet, not gotten any playing time at the NHL level. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked On Wild since 2021 and credentialed media member. And as mentioned, we got some good intel from Sebastian High of Locked On NHL Prospects, talking about what David Jiricek brings to the table and why this was a great acquisition by the Minnesota Wild.
Alrighty, let's keep this episode rolling here by zeroing in a little bit on David Jiricek. He is a really intriguing right shot defenseman at 6'3", 209 pounds. He was selected at 6th overall, as I mentioned in the first segment, by the Columbus Blue Jackets. And he's a player that in the defensive zone applies really effective pressure. I've always really liked how he closes his gaps. He plays aggressively. He takes his defensive risks. He's not one to hold himself back in any way, but he also takes those risks and misses at times, which is the drawback with Jiricek. You're going to have to take some of the bad in order to also have access to the good. With Jiricek, there's definitely still a lot of room to evolve with this player. He still has a lot of runway for a prospect that was drafted 6th overall just two and a half years ago. He's not one of these players that hits their ceiling at an early point in their careers. I think that Jiricek's going to keep getting better and better and better until he's 26, 27 years old, that he still has like 5 or so years of ascension in his development, because the flashes are fantastic. The consistency is a little bit of the issue, but a lot of what he does so well comes either in terms of the defensive aggression or his on-puck play. He's a really dynamic player. He's so creative. He's able to create high-end offensive situation. He can go end-to-end, really deceptive with the puck on his stick. Not to say that he's going to be a Lane Hudson or Quinn Hughes or anything along those lines of like deceptive blue liners, but in terms of that 6'3" frame, over 200 pounds, he is quite deceptive in his movements. He can get around forecheckers quite effectively. He's a solid breakout passer in the offensive zone. He can activate up very comfortably, and I've seen him activate up to the hash mark, cut inside, get a high danger shot off. This is a player that likes to create when he's on the ice, and certainly has been able to do that at the AHL level. He's done fantastically in the AHL for the Cleveland Monsters. I mean, last season he played 29 games there. He scored 7 goals and 19 points. Fantastic production from the blue line in the AHL. And this is also a player that I think it's important to note hasn't really had much time to dominate a league, going back to his D-1 season, probably, maybe even actually D-2 season, when he was splitting his year between the U20 and the U17 levels in Czechia, because in his draft -1 and his draft year, he's playing pro hockey in Czechia with HC Pilsen in the top pro league. and then he came directly over to North America to play in the NHL and AHL. I mean, he scored 38 points in 55 games in his rookie season after being drafted in the AHL as well. And he's just been playing pro hockey ever since. So this isn't a player that's been really put into a situation to learn to dominate, but he's done the best that he's been able to at the AHL level, being really impactful, though perhaps not quite at the dominant level of the league on the blue line, even though the offensive numbers are fantastic. There still are those defensive miscues, and there's a reason that Columbus was hesitant to give him minutes, even though I think in terms of long-term value, we've been very wise to give him a better shot in the NHL with more consistent minutes and a more consistent pairing mate, which I do believe he will be getting in Minnesota. This is one of the things I love about the Minnesota Wild. They develop their prospects not just well, but very intelligently and strategically. I think that Jonas Brodin would be a fantastic player to staple Jiricek to for this season especially, and just kind of get grounded and have a player beside him that can sweep things up when he makes a mistake, where there isn't pressure on him to play a mistake-free game. Because if you pressure Jiricek to play mistake-free, you're not going to get very good hockey out of him. He's going to clutch hard on his stick. You're going to lose a lot of that creativity that makes him special. And that said, this isn't a player who's a slam dunk to be a top pairing or top three defenseman in the NHL just yet. There is certainly some risk associated to this trade for Minnesota, but I think it is well worth it. On the one hand, Minnesota has a stacked prospect pool. Like, that first round pick, I think, was a bit expendable. They want to contend now. Jiricek's a lot closer to playing now than that first round pick will be. And Damon Hunt is one of a myriad of left shot defenders that are quite solid in Minnesota's system, but the right side of defense has been a lot weaker. Apart from Brock Faber, there really aren't any other players in the system that project in a top four capacity down the right side. So Jiricek fills a really important hole and will also thus get the opportunities to develop and get the chances that he needs, because he wasn't really getting those in Columbus this season. So I think that he's a fantastic fit for Minnesota. I think that they did a really good job with this deal. I'd say that Minnesota won the trade overall, though I think that Columbus did well considering the situation here. I think Don Waddell got a decent enough haul for this player. It's not like an overly disappointing trade for them, but I think that's more the circumstances that led to the trade that are perhaps a bit more disappointing to Blue Jackets fans in particular. But I'd say for the Minnesota Wild, I'd give this an A- grade. This is a really hard home run swing. There is certainly some risk associated, but what they sent Columbus's way is certainly expendable with what they have in their system already. And I think that Jiricek is a player that will thrive in Minnesota specifically. I think it's a great landing spot for him. I think that he's a great player to be landing in Minnesota for the team. I think it's just a really good fit on both sides. As for Columbus, I'd give the return a B- grade. I think they did okay given the situation. First round pick, always like to have that in your back pocket. They use their first round picks quite well. So I'm hopeful that they'll get a really solid prospect with that selection. Damon Hunt is a solid piece to just have in your cupboard, but there's a lot of players like kind of in that mold in Columbus, like Jordan Harris is there. You have a lot of players that are perhaps not the biggest, not the most physical, but good puck moving guys that are left shots that are projected as number 5-ish like range of players on the blue line. So there's a little bit of, I think they could have perhaps targeted a player where there wasn't already such a logjam like in their overall depth chart, especially among younger players that play this kind of style. But still, I think it's a decent enough return for Columbus. And overall, a fascinating trade. We don't see these massive prospect trades all that often where it's a big blue chip prospect for a haul of draft picks, but this was a really interesting one, a pretty long trade debacle going up to it. I was curious to see where he's going to end up landing, and Minnesota was my number one destination for him as well. So I think it's overall a great fit.
A great fit, and more of a long play for the Minnesota Wild as opposed to what Columbus is getting in Damon Hunt. We'll talk about why Jiricek is going down to Iowa. We've got some quotes from John Hynes specifically, and we'll take a look at one of the big reasons that he is going to get some seasoning down in Iowa before he comes back up. All coming up on today's episode of Locked on Wild. We'll hear what John Hynes has to say on the situation after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, we got the live show for you coming up at 8 p.m. tonight. Denny's going to go through his Minnesota Wild trade targets with a detailed breakdown, salary cap, what the Wild would need to give up to acquire some impact players to help push this team over the top. So we'll talk about that, as well as answering your questions from earlier in the week. Should be a great show tonight, 8 p.m. Join us right here on YouTube. So Jiricek gets called up after he's traded and spends a few days with the team. And all of a sudden now he gets sent back down to Iowa. What gives? Well, Michael Russo tweeting out a couple of days ago, John Hynes says the Minnesota Wild had a good meeting with David Jiricek before assignment to Iowa. The plan has been to start him there, but the Wild wanted him to first be around and to practice with his new teammates. From Hynes directly, quote, "It's important for David to get in. We had a good meeting with him, gave him some things that we'd like to see, but it was important for him to come here, come to a new organization, meet everybody here, coaches, the players, spend some time, get a feel. Okay, here's how they practice. Here's how they run their meetings. This is the feel of the team. This is how it's run. These are the expectations of how you practice, of how you play." I think it was really good for him, and self-admittedly, that was nice. But he wants to play too, and it's important for him to go down and play, work on some things that we want to see him execute, but get back into playing hockey. Perfectly acceptable for John Hynes to say, okay, we've got a player that's coming into the organization, and we just want to see kind of where he's at in his process. And to be honest, the play of the current defenseman for the Minnesota Wild, the 6 players that have regularly played, is the biggest reason that Jiricek did not get into any NHL action before being sent down to Iowa, because this team continues to be in a playoff push, and it sets, I think, some high expectations on a guy like Jiricek if you throw him in. And I really thought it was interesting that Sebastian talked about pressure to play mistake-free hockey, because that's what you see oftentimes with NHL players when they're first getting going, is you come in and you play tentatively because you are afraid that you're going to make a mistake that's going to get you pulled out of the lineup. And that is, I think, a large part as to what went wrong in Columbus. And it's everybody develops at a different speed. Everybody has a different process that it takes for them to develop and get to the NHL level. We've talked about this quite often. The everydayers that listen to this show know that we got pretty lucky with Brock Faber and Matt Boldy being able to just step in and hit the ground running. For every player like Boldy and Brock Faber, you've got some Marco Rossi's that maybe just take a little bit of time to really have that light bulb moment, as I call it, where everything starts to click. And once it does, they never look back. And for the Minnesota Wild, as much as the regular suspects, the usual suspects that we've talked about in previous seasons. I went through the numbers, I think a couple of weeks ago, for the D pairings that the Wild have predominantly used throughout the course of this season. And all of the numbers are like in the top 20 in the NHL. And there just is no way at this point that you are going to, unless it's for like a game or two, there's just no way that you are going to throw a guy in with how well things are going for this team so far. And I know we point to particular players on the roster and say, well, it's easy to upgrade here, it's easy to upgrade there. But the reality of this situation is you're just not going to make major changes unless something goes wrong and the wheels fall off. That is when you start to see the changes be made. And for as much as we want to see young players get their due, get their day, a lot of these players are still 20, 21, 22, still very young in the process. And the best thing for them at this point is to get games in. So for Jiricek, he's better served playing down in Iowa than he is being the seventh defenseman. And that's why you saw Cameron Crotty get called up, a depth guy who is perfectly suited to be able to take a roster spot and fill in on an emergency basis. For Jiricek, I think the best path for him is to go get a big chunk of minutes playing down in Iowa. But I will say the one spot here that kind of leads to an eyebrow raise is what we have seen from the Iowa Wild. And this is not just a one-year problem. The Iowa Wild over the last few seasons have just not had good seasons. They right now are 8, 11, and 1 through the first 20 games of the season, which puts them 6th in the Central Division. Now that's better than, I want to say they started something like 0-5 to start off the season. So there has been some improvement, but what is the overall plan for the Iowa Wild? That's what I would like to know, is like, what are you building towards? What is the objective? What are you trying to accomplish, as opposed to just go out there and give it everything you've got and try to just win a bunch of games? Like, that's the goal of every team. What are the Iowa Wild coaches doing to further these prospects? Because it seems like for the last couple of years, and admittedly, I have not had a ton of chance to watch the prospects play in Iowa, but it feels like we haven't had any sort of tangible steps forward for any of those guys down at the AHL level. And just looking at the statistics here, you look at a guy like, for instance, David Spacek is currently tied for 3rd on the team in points with 10. Liam Ogren has 8 goals in 10 games, which is pretty fantastic. But some of these other defensemen, some of these other prospects that we have been looking for a while, Carson Lambos, 4 points in 18 games. He is a +4, which is a market improvement over what had happened, the previous seasons. Kyle Masters, 2 points in 9 games, a -2. Ryan O'Rourke, 2 points in 16 games, a -6. Like these, you would think that at some point, Jack Pert, another one, he has no points in 8 games and is a -3. At some point, you would think that these prospects would take that next step, take that leap, take that step forward in their development. We just haven't seen it yet. Now, that certainly points to all of these prospects just being on the this takes longer side, but we do need to also acknowledge the fact that sometimes things just don't pan out, and it doesn't have anything to do with the system or where a particular player is at in their process. Sometimes things just don't work out. Now, looking at Jiricek's numbers, has not played for Iowa yet, as far as I can tell. But in 4 games with the Cleveland Monsters, he had 2 goals and an assist and was a +3. So that's a good start to the. Actually, looks like maybe he did get in to a game for the Iowa Wild here. So 1 game for Iowa, but no points or anything along those lines. It's just gonna take, or actually what that is, if I could just read, Iowa plays tonight. So we'll see how Jiricek does in his first AHL action. But the biggest thing for him at this point, get a bunch of games in, and let's see where you're at in the process. I like the fact that John Hynes gave him some things to work on. So go down to the AHL level and work on them. You're not going to be able to do that being the 7th defenseman on this roster. And unless somebody else gets hurt, those 6 are going to be the ones playing at the Minnesota level until things fall apart. That's just how this works. Like it or not, that's just how this process works. The Wild are tied for the league lead in points, and until the formula shows that it's fatally flawed, this is going to be the group that we see. So Jiricek down to Iowa to work on the things that the coaching staff identified, and they'll see how things go for a bit and reevaluate. But this is definitely more of a long-term play by the Minnesota Wild, as outlined by Sebastian of Locked On NHL Prospects, because as mentioned, you don't have a ton of right shot defensemen in the prospect system that are going to amount to much. So we will take a look at kind of the long-term outlook for this Minnesota Wild prospect system as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Prize Picks. If you love sports, you're going to love Prize Picks, the best place to turn your sports knowledge into real money. Whether it's hockey, football, or any of your favorite sports, Prize Picks makes it easy to get in on the action. Here's why you need to get started today. You can win up to 200 times your money on Prize Picks. Get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. No need to win. The $50 is guaranteed. Prize Picks also offers fun weekly promotions like Taco Tuesday, where select player projections are discounted up to 25%. This week on Prize Picks, I'm eyeing the hockey board, looking at Jack Hughes for more than 4 shots on goal and Artemi Panarin for more than 1 assist. It's so easy to make my picks and have fun with friends while potentially cashing in fast. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL, and you'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 instantly. Prize Picks. Run your game. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Again, make sure to join us tonight at 8 p.m. for another live show. Denny's got a great one lined up. As I said, it's the best show of the week, so make sure you tune in so you don't miss out on any of the fun. We'll answer listener-submitted questions from earlier in the week, and we'll have a great time doing it like we always do. 8 p.m. tonight, right here on the Locked On Wild YouTube channel. So let's look ahead to the outlook for this Minnesota Wild decor, because I think it has the chance to be pretty darn good for this Minnesota Wild team down the road. So obviously you have Jared Spurgeon locked in right now through the 2026-2027 season. And Spurgeon, I know, got off to a rocky start. He's been really good since he returned from his injury hiatus, missing about 5 games. He's been a really good piece of the puzzle for this Minnesota Wild decor. You got Jonas Brodin, obviously on injured reserve right now, as we talked about in the earlier episode today. John Hynes mentioning after the Utah game that Brodin has resumed skating. So getting back on the ice at least is hopefully a good sign for his return. He is locked in through the 2027-2028 season. Jake Middleton is locked in through the 2028-2029 season. Brock Faber's locked in through the 2032-2033 season. These feel like made-up years. So your core 4 right now: Spurgeon, Brodin, Middleton, and Faber. Those are the ones that you have locked in beyond for at least the next 2 to 3 years. Last I checked, you need at least 7. So here's where the question marks come in. Zach Bogosian is signed through the 2025-2026 season, but he has no trade protection, nothing like that. And being at age 34 right now, kind of wonder if maybe he heads elsewhere next after this deal is done, or depending on how these D prospects develop, I would imagine he will be elsewhere by the time his deal is done. John Merrill is signed through this season, and after how the last few seasons have gone, his play has been fine this year. Like I said, that third pairing, whether it be Chisholm and Merrill or Bogosian and Merrill, the numbers are in the top 20 in the league in terms of expected goals against and actual goals against per 60 minutes. They don't give up goals. It doesn't matter who's out there on the ice. They just don't give up goals in this structure. But Merrill is an unrestricted free agent coming up. And I think what will probably happen is that some other team out there sees what happened this year and pays him accordingly for that. So I think Merrill will probably be gone as well. The interesting one is going to be Declan Chisholm, because he is a Group 6 UFA after this season is done. He has stepped in for Jonas Brodin, and with Jared Spurgeon has put together some pretty good numbers statistically as a D pairing. And Chisholm is just 24, so there could be a little something there. He's young enough that there could be a little something there if the Wild want to keep him around beyond his current deal. So if the Wild go with a little bit of a bridge deal, 2 or a 3 year deal to throw him in as the 7th defenseman or one of the 7, might not be a bad idea, because he certainly has some offensive skill to his game. He can run a power play. There's value there. And his defensive play has not been like he's been making some strides defensively too, to where you feel comfortable throwing him out there in the lineup. So maybe Chisholm is another one that you put in the 7. Whether he's the 6th or the 7th doesn't really matter. But he could be one that you throw in that mix of those 7 defensemen. The other players that you have that are going to factor into this are Zeev Boyum, currently playing with Denver. And for Boyum so far this year, he has 19 points in 16 games. He's got 4 goals, 15 assists. He's a +6 Also has 14 penalty minutes in 16 games played. It was a little bit of a slow start for Boyum, but he certainly has started to pick things up as the season has unfolded. Boyum is a left shot defenseman. So let's assume, as we have been talking about for a while, let's assume that once the Denver season is done, he signs his ELC, burns a year, and is with the team at the end of the season to get a little cup of coffee and give him something to work on over the summer. But let's just assume that Boyum is a part of the puzzle full-time next year. So that is 6. Spurgeon, Brodin, Middleton, Faber, and Bogosian. So actually that's 7, depending on what happens with Bogosian. And then the other is Jiricek. And Jiricek being the right shot. So right now you have Spurgeon's a right shot, Bogosian is a right shot, and Faber's a right shot. Bogosian's not going to be staying in the organization long term. Boyum is a left shot. So like Sebastian talked about in the outset, Jiricek can give you some right shot potential. But you don't have to throw him in immediately. Like, you don't have to rush him into the lineup out of necessity. And I think if we get an opportunity to see him in some games this year, after he gets acclimated in Iowa and puts together a nice little run, you have another injury at some point, and you throw him into the lineup just to kind of see where he's at in this process. I think that would be a perfect building block for the guy because, and I don't know what John Hynes said, but I will pretty much guarantee you that he probably offered more of a concrete plan than what Columbus did, which led to the frustration for Jiricek. If I have put in all this good time at the AHL level and can't crack that lineup, and I'm just getting healthy scratched, what's the point? So I'm going to give John Hynes the benefit of the doubt here. Probably, maybe doing that too much. But with what the NHL team has done so far this year, unless there is another injury defensively, the path for Jiricek is to get acclimated to the organization in Iowa. But also, as we talked about in the middle segment today, the Iowa team has been an adventure. So it will be very interesting to see how Jiricek does over these next couple of weeks to get acclimated. And if he really tears it up at the Iowa level and forces his way onto the NHL roster, this is going to look like a home run for Bill Guerin. It's probably already between a ground rule double and a triple. But if Jiricek forces the issue, this is going to look like a home run for the Minnesota Wild. So hopefully this gives you a little more intel into Jiricek ahead of seeing him at the NHL level. And we'll see what happens with his process here over the next few weeks. But that'll do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to join us for tonight's live show, which you'll probably hop into a few minutes after this is done. And we'll go through some trade targets here tonight, and we'll have a great time doing it. So join us at 8 for tonight's live show. And again, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. We have new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.